The John Peel Archive presents Classic Album Sundays on Audio Note UK at the John Peel Centre. We've featured the album Kilimanjaro by the Teardrop Explodes, playing John Peel's very own personal copy, with a special guest appearance by the inimitable Julian Cope. Then it was time for the feature interview with the star of the show, aside from John Peel's personal vinyl copy of the album, of course, Julian Cope. Hello. Have a seat. So welcome to the John Peel Centre.
Thank you.
Now tell me, when did you start listening to John Peel?
I've got some notes here. I was the product of social climbers who thought that to be a real kind of artist, you had to not read the Sunday Times, but read what the Daily Mail wrote, quoting from the Sunday Times. So I actually wasn't allowed to play rock and roll, listen to rock and roll till I was about 12.
Really?
Yeah, so when I was 12, I went straight to John Peel.
And what records was he playing?
It's really weird now, because whatever you do nowadays, if you want it, you can immediately do what the Americans call, you can achieve closure. Yeah, you can reach it. What was that? They played, and you know it, and you don't even have to pay for it. But you know, like in those days, you'd hear it through a crystal machine, and wonder what it was. I just wrote down a few of the moments that kind of most informed me from Peel. Because there's one thing that I didn't... He played this single over and over again. And it was like the ultimate hippie single. It was like a good old boy from, I don't know, Kentucky or something. Mm-hmm. And every time he'd finish, he'd go, all right, that was I Don't Care by Maeve Nutter. And then he'd go on. Like, I don't care by who? And eventually, I just forgot about it. But it always stuck in my head, because it went like this. It went, sitting all alone in the house in the East Jail, watching TV, drinking beer in my underwear. A telephone rang, got a knock upon my door. Oh, the door. Ran around the house and finally got the sneakers on. Went to the door and everybody there was gone. I don't care. Boom, boom, boom. And it went on like that. And it was like second verse, same as the first kind of song. And right at the end, it went, sitting all alone in the house in the East Jail, watching TV, drinking beer in my underwear. A telephone rang, got a knock upon the door. Ran around the house and finally got my sneakers on. Went to the door and everybody there was gone again. So I just got up and put on my clothes and went back to my own house. And I wanted that single, and I probably never had an opportunity. And then I found it on eBay for about $1 3 years ago. And it was amazing, because now you can find this stuff. But that was Peel, you know? And because my mother was one of these people who, I don't understand jazz. So she thought that she was lower than jazz musicians because she didn't get it. She didn't realize it was just cack. So I would always have this generous attitude. Because it was Peel, I'd be like, well, Peel must know something that I don't know. So he'd played the Boys of the Lock, or the High Level Ranters. And it would be, and all this. And I'd be like making a cup of tea or a sausage sandwich. And it took me until punk to realize that it was just, you know, I thought it was shit. And Peel couldn't know everything in the world.
So when you started listening to him when you were still living in Tamworth, did it, I mean, obviously it opens up your mind musically, but did it also kind of open up your mind to alternative lifestyles as well?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
I decided that you could make a pest of yourself in the house to such a degree that they just give you a bit of space. Mm-hmm. So even though we lived in a semi-detached, I excavated a bit of space, and everything about Peel was lifestyle. Like, he even had his own record label, and there was like a Dandelion Records was his record label, and it was a really cool record label. But better still, the lifestyle was clear because there was him and his missus naked in the bath on the front. So I was like, that's what I want. I want things like this. And sure enough, it did. So you go into our house now, and every room in our house is like the ultimate teen bedroom. It's not a it's like, actually, it's like House on Acid. Yeah. It all goes back to that.
And when you moved to Liverpool, did you make the connection that John was from Liverpool? Was that any influence?
Yeah, man, because he made a big deal about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But also, I ended up going to Liverpool because I was sort of kicked out of the house. It was just kind of they washed their hands of me in a northern style. But I knew Peel was big enough in the 70s for him. If you got played on Peel, then it was something of a hit. So, I got into krautrock purely because of Peel, because Peel played Armand Duel, and the only people in Tamworth who had Armand Duel were like the heavy hippies who were like 4 years older than me. And there was one copy of Yeti, the double album, so you'd just be like tripping, just looking at the sleeve. And it was so ferocious and dynamic. And it just made Pink Floyd look like, they were just so peaceful. The drumming did sound like a man about to collect Aston Martins. Whereas Armand Duel had two drums, and they were both frenetic and freaked out, And so we'd play all of this stuff, and my friend Cott recorded a lot of it on Revox, so we'd listen to it in Cott's, and Cott was 3 years older than me, and we'd listen to it and take it very, very seriously. And he played Hallo Gallo by Noy enough times for it to be, it's a hit. That's a radio hit.
So you already had a good musical education from Peel before you moved from Tamworth to Liverpool.
Yeah, I'd say that was really, I look back now, and it's funny because I was from the Midlands, right? And from the Midlands, I felt bad, right, when I went to Liverpool because I wasn't a Bowie fan. And to say that this week is the wrong thing. And I don't mean that in an ungenerous way, because I thought Bowie was amazing. But I had kind of a bit secretly, because I was brought up in the Midlands, and in the Midlands, everybody was like Sabbath. If you wanted to be, anything effeminate, was the most effeminate they got in the Midlands was like the Edgar Broughton Band. We're talking like, like Captain Beefheart was gay to people in the Midlands. So we didn't have that. So Peel would play, Peel played a lot of Mark Bolan, and he played a lot of Bowie. So Bowie was around all the time before he'd made it. And he did a great Peel session. I took it more seriously when he did a Peel session. He did a great version of White Light, White Heat. He did a Peel session version of the Superman. And I thought, and Peel would play the Superman in any case. But then when Hunky Dory came out, it was the first Darcier album, and they really pushed it. And it didn't do anything, but they really pushed it. And I remember Peel being gutted because he thought it was going to be big. And I can always remember that when Ziggy came out, there'd be the baton change would be, Anne Nightingale was before John Peel. She was like 9 till 10, and he was 10 till midnight. And she wasn't Annie Nightingale in those days. She was Anne Nightingale. And I remember her saying, so, what do you think? In the kind of the baton change between, into 10 o'clock. What do you think, John? I really think that David Bowie's really nailed it with this Ziggy Stardust album. And he's going, yeah, I really think he will. And I thought it was crap, actually. I thought it sounded like Rock Follies. I mean, I know I was proved wrong, but I did. But I can always remember that, and that was a very important thing, to remember moments. That's one of the things that... But I've got a very peculiar memory. The other day I remembered all the registration numbers of my father's cars in the 60s. Like out of nowhere, I just came running into Dorian and I went, EUE 458C. A Vauxhall Victor, red and white. And she's like, oh, that's really good. No, KGT 173D, a Humber Scepter. That's really interesting. 479 CAY, an earlier Vauxhall Victor. So these moments are kind of, like everything for me is a kind of a Jean-Paul Sartre moment. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so really Peel very much, I had a lot of Jean-Paul Sartre moments.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peel was an early musical influence, but then you moved to Liverpool, and there were a couple people there who probably were quite an influence on you musically as well. Roger Eagle and Jeff Davies from Probe. Can you tell us about that? Going to Liverpool, it's a big city now. You're the kid from Staffordshire. I know Staffordshire well. My husband's from there, so I know Staffordshire very well.
Staffordshire is, I'm not saying it's a cultural wilderness.
Maybe.
Yeah, what it is I think that there was a fastidious state-backed terrorist thing to destroy all culture in the Midlands. So, it came through. You had to be ultra rigorous to get through. For me, it was good because I was called Julian. So that's two, Julian's like two girls' names. So I had to be really hard. So I got used to fighting, but fighting over my name and my rights to be called Julian. So going up to Liverpool was quite easy because, everybody was wantonly what they were. So, everybody was rampant, and the gay club was also the punk club, which that wasn't in Manchester. In Manchester, they just had, I think it was just bigger, less of an enclave. Liverpool's a real enclave. So I just thought punks and gay people, well, I've been called a queer all my life, so I'm home. But also Roger Eagle, who ran Eric's, was a huge reggae fan. Now, I had nothing in common with Liverpool in terms of the way that I looked. When I went to Liverpool, I looked like Leif Garrett. Yeah? Kind of like an unhip Daryl Hall. But I knew my reggae and I knew my underground music like nobody. And I walked to school when I was at school. Tamworth was a real kind of Birmingham overspill place. So I walked to school with the guy who became the keyboard player in the most roots reggae band in the Midlands, Steel Pulse. Mm-hmm. So we'd be walking to school, and he'd be telling me this stuff, and I hadn't liked Bob Marley, because he just had this element of rock about it, and he didn't like Bob Marley, but he did like very heavy-duty stuff. So he was telling me about all this Joe Gibbs and stuff like this.
I love Joe Gibbs.
Yeah. So he's telling me about all this stuff, and this is like 75. So by the time I got to Liverpool in late 76, I did have that grounding. And John Peel, the first time I went to Eric's, played the whole of You Do Right by Can, which is like, the full side of an album. There weren't many punk singles at that time. Mm-hmm. So he went entirely the other way. But then otherwise, the only thing that was out was like Slaughter and the Dogs and Anarchy in the UK. So we had to like fill up the evenings.
And what other kinds of things did Roger Eagle play at the Eagle, aside from reggae?
He'd play a lot of what Peel would play. Big Eyed Beans from Venus by Captain Beefheart. Sun Zoom Spark by Captain Beefheart. Tail Dragger by Howlin' Wolf. He'd play, I remember, because I was a bit of a soul boy, a hairy soul boy. Tamworth was the centre of Northern Soul. And there was a guy there called Lee Smart who used to play me this really fast. Northern Soul really is just soul that hadn't made it in the charts because it was too frenetic, I think. And the guys, so it wasn't really, obviously, it wasn't made for the Northern Soul market. It had merely failed in the wider world. So Lee Smart would play me all this stuff, and it was just hectic. And when I got there, there'd be a lot of Northern Soul played. Peel used to play It's Better to Have and Don't Need by Don Covey in 75. He played that a lot. And suddenly I was hearing it on Roger Eagle's system.
And also hearing it amongst other people who were kind of from a similar musical tribe as you as well. Did you feel like all of a sudden you kind of fit in? Because I remember I felt that way when I moved to New York. I just thought, I've arrived. Here I am. Where, why haven't I been here yet?
Yeah.
Did you feel like that? It's like the small town boy. Did you feel like you fit in, or did you feel like an outsider?
Like an outsider. I think what made it amazing was, I'm the kind of punk was a period. It was a revolution because it was an opportunity for chances. And I was a chancer. There's always room for one person who doesn't conform to the rules. And they thought I was really posh. What they didn't realize was that I lived in a semi-detached house, but my mother was an English and history teacher and wouldn't let me speak in the Midland accent. So they all thought I was posh. So when I realized that there's no point in going, well, I'm not actually posh, I just thought, I'll just be posh. And as soon as I was posh, people liked me. I'm like, Pete Burns invited me to dinner, at his mum's. And his mum said, why is he not wearing makeup? Like all punks wear makeup. It's like, well, no, but she had Pete Burns' worldview, and she'd been brought up, she was a Berliner who'd escaped during the war. But it meant that, I realized that the only way that I would be accepted was to be a grotesque caricature of myself. That's really what I quickly became. And in order to compete.
Right, because it seems to me that Liverpool has a very colorful cast of characters, that people are really kind of turned out of themselves. From what I understand, this is as an outsider myself, but they don't seem as reserved as they are down south. They seem like it's almost like a different country. And then there seems like to be a real dreamland.
Dreamland. I've got this thing about... The reason Thatcher went to war with Liverpool during her tenure was because I believe that in Britain there were two Celtic cities, Glasgow and Liverpool. And Liverpool is an enclave. It's even, I used to hitch in and out of Liverpool is a killer hitch, because the road going into Liverpool, you could be going to a million different places. Nobody's ever going to Liverpool. Everybody's going to Manchester because it's a main artery. But during punk, like television never played in Liverpool. Blondie never played in Liverpool. Patti Smith never played in Liverpool. So you'd have to hitch or take a bus down the East Lancs Road to Manchester to see these bands. And you'd see, whereas like, say, Suicide were the only people who were, Liverpool was the only place where they were big enough to do their own gig. Everywhere else they had to support the Clash.
And they're real outsiders as well.
Well, yeah, but they were bottled everywhere except Liverpool, where everybody wanted to give them head.
Frankie Teardrop, lovely. But with Liverpool, why do you think it seems like it's a city where the Jungian kind of consciousness is more evident, and the dream world, and this school of language, music, dream, and pun, and just a more expansive imagination. Do you feel that's a characteristic of Liverpool, and why do you think that is, if so?
I think that I was going to say that there's a big Irish influence on Liverpool. But recently, because I'm writing a novel that's very, very involved in that whole Celtic Sea, the Irish Sea, and I was thinking, no. I think I might have got it wrong all these years. I think that it's the other way round, that maybe everybody started in Liverpool and then thought, let's go rural, and they went and found themselves in Ireland. So I think the Irish might actually be proto-Liverpudlians. It won't go down well in Ireland, but it's a theory.
But do you agree? Do you think the Irish, the Celtic, the Celts have more of an expansive imagination? Is that?
Yeah, man. Well, I did this book on ancient Europe, right? And the only way you can do a book on ancient Europe is by going everywhere and really trying to find it, and be generous to everybody there. But you have to see it from the world you know. And from my world, going into Ireland was amazing because the expectations were slowed down. Like I'd be in Cork in the middle of nowhere, I'd be walking, and I'd walk for ages, and I'd knock on a door, and I'd go, excuse me, can I look at your stone circle? Why would you want to be looking at that? And I'm like, well, I'm doing a book. Oh, and you don't know. I only said doing a book once because as soon as you're doing a book, then they want to know why you're doing a book. And in the end, it's like, well, you'll need some breakfast. It's only 6 a.m. I'm like, I had breakfast. I've been up since 4. Well, my mother's just about to have some breakfast. Would you like a cup of tea while I make my mother some breakfast? So old Dodderer comes downstairs. I've run out of bacon. Would you mind if I pop down the shops? Could you look after me mother? So it's like 8 o'clock in the morning before I'm I'm like, I could have stayed in bed and just sneaked round the back of the field. Liverpool's the only place that displays that lax attitude towards time. It's like, if you get there the right day, they're happy. And that's really good. Mm-hmm. In England, it's one of the, Liverpool is not in England, only technically.
So you have this great cast of characters, a great sense of imagination, a great sense of dreams, and also ambition. And also
utter delusion. Because it's your world. It's my world, and if I don't make it, well, I'm huge in any case. Because it's like it's a macro Walter Mitty existence. And everybody lived by the Ian Hunter lyric, you look like a star, but you're still on the dole. It's like, I think that was something those are twin truths that people in Liverpool, held as they walked down the street. There's a song on Kilimanjaro, Treason, and the lyric is, mirror hopping days are a course reaction. And mirror hopping days, it was about, we walked down the street and we found this way of walking into the town centre where there were all these different sort of full-length shop windows that acted as mirrors. So you could am I cutting it? Do I cut it? Oh, wow, I look better than I thought. And you could just hop from mirror to mirror till you always were on stage. Mm-hmm. And that's a Liverpool thing, I think.
And also with forming bands, is this true that you kind of had a concept or a manifesto or an idea how you looked before there were even any songs that were written?
I hate it if you don't have a concept. Because if you don't have a concept for your band, you might just ask a guy who likes country and western to join your space rock band. And he might have a good kit, and you might feel slightly indebted to him because you secretly know you're all crap. And you might feel like, as a token, as a sop to him, you have to do, one country and western song. In the Midlands, you'd do that. You'd go down, you'd go to Tamworth Youth Club, and, there'd be this, black funk, and they're playing, all this kind of James Gang stuff. And then because the bass player was the one who owned all the gear, you'd have to also do, the Black Eyed Boys by Paper Lace. Mm-hmm. They're totally undermining your metaphor, man.
So what was the concept? Because you had a few bands, some of them that did perform, maybe a couple of times, some that didn't. What were the concepts behind the Crucial 3 or Shallow Madness? All your pre-Teardrop bands.
Crucial 3 was totally Wiley's concept. Bless you. We were just vibing. Mm-hmm. And Mac was amazing, right? I've got to say this because it's amazing. I think it's really almost heroic that Ian McCulloch had such a good career, because at the time he was sort of, well, I always say he'd have been chained to a bed, chained to the end of an iron bed if he'd been brought up in Romania. It's like I thought he was half-witted for the first 6 months. Wiley used to lead him around. But that's why punk was an opportunist time. Mm-hmm. And what I mean heroic, he's kept it together, so I know it's become, more tousled as he's got older. Mm-hmm. But that's why punk was such an opportunist thing. Because I just put my foot in the door, Pete Burns, you need a bass player, and I can play bass. And nobody else could play bass. Most people couldn't play guitar because it was that chancerish. And when Pete didn't tell me to fuck off, then I was there. That's me there. Okay, well, he can stand having a posh middle and bass player. I reckon he could stand having a posh middle and bass player who does backing vocals. And bit by bit, I just kind of like leaned in. And everybody was like that. So the Crucial Three was really Wiley saying, we should be called the Crucial Three. And as me, at the time, was just a middle and non-head, I thought, well, if I'm one of the Crucial Three, then I must be great. Yeah, so they've hoodwinked, I've hoodwinked them into thinking that I can be in a band called the Crucial Three. That means I'm better than them, really, because I've hoodwinked them. So from then on, I can be full of myself to here. And I realized in Liverpool, you have to, if you're not full of yourself, you have to at least appear full of yourself. So I just, ripped off everybody else's full of themselfness and applied it to myself.
Did you feel you were a bit more expressive than they were?
Only because they were almost autistically inexpressive. They were monosyllabic as a collective. Wiley was the only one who had his own IQ.
But back to these kinds of bands, before you formed the Teardrops, I mean, you had all these bands. They were almost like phantom bands, but you kind of talked about it as if they were real.
Yeah, man.
Can you tell us about, I mean, did you really believe it? Did you think some of these bands really were going to happen?
Yeah, man, because I'd had similar bands back in Tamworth. Nobody would play with me in Tamworth. But then again, I had a Sabutio league, which was similarly sociopathic. People didn't want to play Sabutio with me because I had a star goalie and a manager, and the star goalie was cuckolding the manager because he had like a model wife. And people would be like, fuck off, I want to play football. I'm like, no. It's been a bad week here. So I just took that aesthetic and applied it in Liverpool. Yeah.
So tell us about forming the Teardrop Explodes. What was your manifesto before you even recorded a song, before you did Sleeping Gas, for instance? What was the manifesto? What was the idea?
I am going to form a band that can play a song to its conclusion. High-reaching, eh? I saw Gary Dwyer, the drummer in the Teardrop Explodes, for the first time in, 2 decades. I saw him last February. And we were hanging out. Came to our house, and we was with Andy Eastwood, who was also a dear friend. And Eastie was downstairs hanging with my women. And so Gary and I were upstairs, and we were well bounced. And Gary looked at me and he said, Cope. He's looking around because my bedroom is it's video blue, and it's just it's absurd. Absurdly cozy and absurdly cosmic. And he looked around and he said, Cope, did you always did you have a plan to be a big far out artist? And I just laughed. I just burst out laughing. I said, Gary, don't take this the wrong way, but if I'd had any plans, you wouldn't have been in the band. Because you could only play 2 beats, and one of them Budgie taught you, and the other was the same one played fast. And he just did laugh, and he went, Cope, I wasn't I? I said, you had your auntie's drum kit. When he was the only one who approached me, right? The rest I had to, sort of, no, I don't play keyboards. You do play, I've heard that you've played keyboards. No, I don't want to be in your band. But Gary approached me. I've got my auntie's drum kit. And I thought, that is total. He's been reading the lives of the Celtic saints. That's just hagiography. And it turned out that his father was a rockabilly guitarist, really cool guy. And his sister had learned to play the drums to accompany him so that he could rehearse. And everybody in Liverpool in the 60s was in a band. So it was genuinely his auntie's drum kit. So he played this beat that Budgie taught him. And I was trying really hard to work out how I could apply those, my riffs to songs that he could play. Because he did play, and the other drummer was very influenced by Carl Burns from The Fall. Carl Burns, the first drummer in the Fall, he'd be like, and Mark Smith would just like rant, and then whenever the diddle-diddle-diddle is, he'd stop. Well, our drummer, Dave Pickett, he didn't see the diddle-diddle-diddle as a musical thing. He saw that as a way of hiding the fact that he'd lost the beat. So you go boom, potato, potato, I'm like, mate, do it, count 4 and then do it. So when Gary Dwyer played, he sounded like something like King Tubby, because Budgie was going through this obsessive reggae thing. And then he learned a soul beat, and I think he learned the soul beat off Ian Brody, because Gary was a big in Japan fan. I was like, he can do 2 beats and he's got a kit. I'm going to base the entire band around what he can do. Because I had a keyboard player who was Paul Simpson, who was brilliant conceptually, but couldn't play anything at all. So I was like, all these white notes are cool. These black notes, use those in the weird bits. And so, tune my bass, because I could actually play. Tune the bass, and Paul Simpson, in the early set, because Paul Simpson wasn't really a keyboard player and didn't wish to learn to play keyboards, he'd play on one part, and then he'd absent himself when it came to the chorus. And when it came to Sleeping Gas, which was the first single, I said, look, if you do that, if you splay your hands right there, when it comes to the solo, you just go like that. And then it'll be kind of quite rock. It'll be quite, 96 Tears. And so he just did that. But yeah, all it was a question of, my plan was to form a band that would do a Peel session. Nowadays, right, like you meet people and then it's like, so, when you did your 7th album, and the 7th album was a disaster, and they go, well, I meant to do that. And I didn't mean to do any of it. And I really think it's important to stand back this far and just go, it was just an opportunistic time. I mean, I had an absolute fastidious roadmap written out. Blah, 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 blah. We do a single, blah, blah, blah. Sounds gives us, blah, blah, blah. NME likes this, blah, blah, do a Peel session. After that, the roadmap peters out. It's like, split up? I don't know. Kind of. What do you want to do? When we did Sleeping Gas, Paul Simpson's hanging out the window the morning that the press comes out. Sounds has given us single of the week. And I was quite floored, because I thought it was great. But it just meant that people, that I was reaching parity with other people, other cultural explorers. But everybody else in the band just went off and got pissed. And I just thought, no, this is symbolic. And I spent my money on a new bedroom carpet. I'm a professional musician now. It really meant something,
But were you comfortable singing and being the front person?
Mac was a great singer, right? Being almost blind was really useful for him. I once saw him, he hailed the bus, and it was actually a Pantechnicon. But that was really useful, because it meant that he was less scared on stage. So I was brazen. And I had to fight so much to get him out of bed in the morning, so that when I and it wasn't me who kicked him out of a Shallow Madness, and the only reason I kicked him out was because he was in bed. And Mick Finkler had to come from halfway across. And Mick Finkler was from like a posh, achieving, law family in Childwall. So they didn't want Mick in a group. And Mick was good. He was educated, and he younger than us, and he had a Fender Telecaster. I was in a band with a guy with a Fender Telecaster. I'm like, I'm keeping him at any cost. And Matt would not get out of bed. He got so lazy, we actually started rehearsing in the flat where he lived, so he couldn't be late, and he'd still be late.
Just set the mic up on the side of the bed so he can just roll over.
And in the end, I just thought, well, this is an opportunistic time. I've had to come all the way from Tamworth. I've had to find a way of living. And, so I kicked him out, and then nobody else wanted to be in the band. So I said, I'm going to be the singer. And everybody was like, oh, but you can't leave because I know things about you.
So as the singer of the Teardrop and as the front person, there were a lot of lineup changes. And I know Bill Drummond once said to you, he didn't even consider the Teardrop Explodes as a bona fide group in the same way that the Echo and the Bunnymen were. Did you agree with that, or how did it make you feel?
Yes, of course, totally. The Bunnymen hung together because they had absolutely nothing without the Bunnymen. I'm not being mean about the Bunnymen. They were amazing. They were mates of mine. But, Will was cooking slop in Debenhams. He had long hair, and he had to have his hair in a hairnet and wear a white coat. And we'd go into Debenhams and sit down, and have free egg on toast because he'd cooked it. He didn't want to be doing that. Punk was an opportunity. Well, I remember the best quote I ever heard in a Bunnymen interview. Will and Les. Les wasn't posh. He had a lovely family. But he was like, upper working class kind of thing. He lived in a nice house. And I remember the best quote I ever heard, and I was there when he said it. He said, Will said, me and Les was always the slowest tads in our class. The slowest tads in our class. I mean, really, that's a great way of describing yourself, and then go on to have a 35-year career. That says something generous about Western culture. That democracy, when it's offered, is taken up by opportunist people. Sometimes the internet drives me crazy, but I love to see it because it's genuinely democratic. Winston Churchill, if he'd known, what democracy could be, he would have become the Nazi he secretly always was. That's my estimation.
Well, let's go back to the Teardrop Explodes and Echo and the Bunnymen. Obviously, there's a lot of rivalry, not just between your two groups, but it seemed like between all of you. And is Treason, the song Treason, does that allude to the kind of jealousies and rivalries and competitions between the bands at the time?
Yes.
How so? Can you tell us about what made you, how were you feeling at that time? Were you feeling like you were keeping up with everybody else? Were you in the lead? Were you just behind?
I was very evidence-based from the beginning. If somebody couldn't string two words together, I'd just think, how are they doing so well? And I realized that, one thing I'd never done is appear uneducated. And that's really important. To drag those bastards up from their monosyllabic ways, to take the piss out of themselves, was essential. But really, I think looking back, you need a certain amount, or you need people to be playing roles and people to be happy to play roles. So I was just very, very keen to work out what my role was and play it extremely well. Bill Drummond, I never knew whether he liked me. I did know he did like me, clearly liked me, but I never knew whether he liked anybody because he was always so removed. He had this kind of like lowland Scotland, Presbyterian, dour, and yet utterly cosmic, not on drugs. His demeanor, I remember Dorian, when I met Dorian, my wife, she was 19, and she said she looks back and she thought Drummond was like 45 at the time. Not because he looked 45, but his demeanor was so 45. The most important thing is that they were all there. It was a cross-generational thing. Because Eric's was also a gay club, it meant that you'd got people like Bob Wooler, who'd been the DJ at the Cavern Club was there, and he could be really cool and flamboyant, and he was a legend. And so we go, oh, tonight we got Bob Wooler, yay! I mean, everybody's generous enough to go, who the fuck are you? We don't know you. We know you're Bob Wooler. Be Bob Wooler. And so he'd become really Bob Wooler, and everybody would rise to being who they were. It meant that the monosyllabic people even became more monosyllabic, because it's like, great, I can be that person. I can be the guy who failed his CSEs, and that's essential. It's rock and roll. Mm-hmm. I think we hit rock and roll at a really lucky time because it had been going long enough to be clearly a sustainable thing, but it clearly wasn't Tommy Steele anymore. Mm-hmm. I look back now and I think, well, everything was. I explained to my girls, right? I got my first Doors album. I got the first Doors album. That was the first album I got, and I got it because my mate Cott found a pay packet on the floor in Birmingham. We looked at each other and we were like, how much is there in there? And it was 18 quid. We were like, that's enough for us to go out for a meal and buy a brand new album each. And we all were determined to go into Birmingham Virgin, when it was still had aircraft seats and it was full of mad heads, and buy something we'd never ever be able to justify normally because it was a windfall. And I bought the first Doors album, brand new. And my mate Herb Leake laughed at me and he went, that's 6 years old. You're a tosser. So that means that it was 1973. And at the time in 1973, 6 years old was like, well, it might as well have been, Nut Rocker by Kim Fowley. It was just a totally of a different time. We got home and everybody derided the organ sound because it didn't sound like, John Lord from Deep Purple. But that's the great telescoping of time. And by punk, you were looking back at two decades and 3 generations of rock and rollers. So you had all these different people that you could not so much copy, but nick bits from. Mm-hmm. And everybody in Liverpool was looking like a star, but they're still on the dole.
Right, yeah. Well, the thing that's interesting to me, again, as an American, and I looked at the UK and the different cities and the types of music that come out of each city. What intrigued me is, I had a radio show when I was 18, 19, 20 called Plastic Tales from the Marshmallow Dimension. I kid you not. I like to think that, John Peel had one called The Perfume Garden, so I must be okay. So I was really into psychedelic and prog kind of stuff and krautrock. And what interests me is that Liverpool was really into the American psychedelic rock, like the 13th Floor Elevators, the Seeds, Chocolate Watch Band, Electric Prunes. And why were you guys into that kind of music when, say, Sheffield was probably looking towards Germany? Manchester is kind of looking at the dance music coming out of Manhattan. It's very specific to Liverpool.
I think what it was with Liverpool was because it was a port, you got better reggae. You got reggae that didn't come into London. Admittedly, you got stuff in London that didn't come into Liverpool. But I think, looking back, the evidence is strong that you got a hell of a lot of stuff just coming in. You got really unusual soul stuff coming into Liverpool. So people were used to touting a record as though it was a totem that would drag you there. Well, we've got to go and listen to Roger because he's the only one with a copy of Great Stone by King Tubby. And you'd have to go there. And people used them as weapons. And I think that, looking back, I had a habit of thinking that if I was into it and Will Sargent was into it, everybody in Liverpool loves that. What it really meant was I loved it, Will loved it, Paul Simpson loved it, but didn't have a copy. Yorkie loved it and didn't have a copy. So we're talking about people didn't have a copy of these things. So finding them was, you needed to find genuinely mind-manifesting things. That's why psychedelia is mind-manifesting. And I liked raging music. I didn't like passive psychedelia. I liked raging music. I liked it to be, I liked them to provide evidence of, not long for this earth. Rock and roll was meant to be, Hunter S. Thompson says the only people who know where the edge is are the people who've gone over it. And that's it. I can, just moving on a few years, I lost my mind. And I did the album Fried, and I was naked under a turtle shell. And I remember somebody a couple of years ago going, I love the cover to Fried, it's so honest. I'm like, what's honest about being naked under a turtle shell? It's patently, obviously, off its rocker. I've just fallen way over the other side. All it was a massive two fingers to a big record company. Because I was mentalized. And as Dorian said, I was fried. And when you're fried from drugs, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're so fried you don't know it. Because I would spend great deals of time just looking out of the window. When you look like that, you know that you've looked like that, because when you hear somebody coming up the stairs, you buck up and you go, oh no, I'm not really looking like this. Hi, how's everything? And then people would come and see me, and I'm, oh, Peter Freitas is coming down. And by the time he arrived, I'd be, hi, how are you? Because I wanted him to come again, and I knew he wouldn't come and see me again if I was like,
You were talking about the music, the psychedelic music, but you just mentioned Hunter S. Thompson. What were you reading at the time before you recorded this album?
I think that I was reading the Metaphysical Poets. Andrew Marvell, John Donne. Stuff that I wanted to make beautiful, wild illusions. I didn't want it to be typically rock and roll. I wanted to use the rock and roll. I wanted to make a rock and roll by writing in repetition. So when I'd write my lyrics down, I'd write. You wandered into my dreams last night, and you stood them all up in a row. Okay, but I want to be able to just have. So I'd write down something, and then I'd go. I could repeat that. That would work as a chorus. It's far out, but I could also repeat it. Mm-hmm. So it was very much. I wanted to write something that didn't just sound like a Jim Morrison ripoff, that didn't just sound erudite the way Arthur Lee was, because I wasn't erudite. Arthur Lee was a smart guy at a time. He was smarter when he was younger than I was. When I was his age, I wasn't as smart as he was. I became much smarter as I got the confidence to know that the music business, I owed them so much money they couldn't fuck me off. That's a really major thing, right? Because in the early days, first few years, they don't have enough money invested in you, so they might just say, oh, it's not worth it. Wash your hands of this guy. You get so involved with certain people in the music business and the record company, like, well, we've got to try and get something back. Let's record one more album. Damn it, he's naked under a turtle shell. Maybe we'll let him do one more album after that. So you're kind of like hanging him. It's like, I can do it. There's a chorus in me again. Yeah, but in terms of, as I say, once the roadmap finished with the Peel session, it was like, now you can do an album. Oh, all right then. Mm-hmm. So now I've got to really get my metaphysical self together. And then, of course, we were virtually finished Kilimanjaro when I took my first acid trip. Somebody goaded me into it. A journalist threw the gauntlet down He gave us a great review, and he said, but the only thing is, can Julian Cope write real acid lyrics? So I took acid, and I could. It wasn't that much different in terms of lyrically. I was quite surprised that if you do have a mind that manifests, it will be entirely changed, but just by saturating yourself in John Donne allusions, it's going to take you part of the way there. You know.
Now, you recorded the album. First, let's actually back up to the Peel session, because was Reward in any way associated with your Peel session, the song Reward?
Yeah, man. We got a new guitarist. It's terrible, right? When you're in the studio, and there'll be musicians here who get this. You're in the studio, right? And you're listening to it, and you've all got headphones on, and you're like, there's a horrible squeaky sound going on here. What's this? And bit by bit, you realize that the guitarist is playing something horrible. And you never noticed it because you've just been at a club playing it really loud over a PA, or in rehearsal really loud. And the loudness has hoodwinked you into thinking it's musically sound. And somebody's playing a clash of sounds that's unharmonic with the heavens. Well, and Bill Drummond was producing it, saying, there's something a bit awful going on here. And we came back and came in and we had a post-mortem. And we kept finding out that it was Mick Finkler, the guitarist, who played great kind of funky, like sub-pop group guitar. But he couldn't quite reconcile that with getting all through an album. So we got around it by saying, can you be more dynamic? What do you mean? Can you just not play on that bit?
I'm also thinking like the first line of Reward, bless my cotton socks, I'm in the news.
Yeah,
was that like a reference to finally getting a Peel session?
Second Peel session. Mm-hmm. Second Peel session.
So did you feel like you had really made it then?
Well, I had.
Yeah, I guess you had. Yeah.
I tell you what, it's really weird. We're going about opportunism, right? First time I appeared on the front cover of Sounds, I only had 2 singles out. Now you're an American, okay? It's hard to explain because the British people will understand this. You know, British record-buying audience of the late 70s will understand that we were children of fads, and if it was that Secret Affair, the new people will have Secret Affair tattooed upon their top lip after 2 singles. So I was on the front cover of Sounds with Mick Finkler. Our drummer was on the front cover of the NME, I think before Kilimanjaro came out. We were a massive cult following. That's why we got signed, because Treason sold shitloads. Mm-hmm. So what it meant was that by the time we got to do the second Peel session, we'd got our new guitarist in, and
Andy Gill.
Alan Gill.
Alan Gill.
Alan Gill. And he's the most intuitive non-career mover of all time. He's like, I suggest that I'll play this. And he played me this song. And I was writing most of the music. And he played me this song. And I was like, he said, I just thought, Julie, that you'd play. This is a kind of a soul bass line. I was like, yeah, man, it's amazing. And he played it. And he said, and you play this, Balfi. And Balfi played it. And it was like, and Gary, you just play what you can play on drums. And Gary went, I can do that. And he said, and then when it comes to this bit, and that's how Reward was written. And so I just said, okay, I can write. He said, just write a melody and some lyrics over that. So I wrote a melody and put Bless My Cotton Socks, I'm in the News, because I thought, well, second Peel session, we've arrived. And when they heard it, every one of them was like, that's the worst opening lyric of all time. And then they heard it back again. And Dale Griffin, who's just died, I loved Buffin, right? The drummer from Mott has just died. He produced that session. And Dale Griffin, I always felt it must be awful to have been Dale, because after Mott the Hoople, He'd have to go down to Maida Vale because his job was to record Radio 1 sessions, not just Peel sessions, Kid Jensen sessions, Mike Reed sessions. So from playing all these classic albums, playing drums, right, he's suddenly reduced to like fussy, needy, indie band drummers. He's like, that's the worst drumming I've ever heard in my life. I'll put something on it. In other words, he'd make it so that you couldn't hear the drumming. But he did a great job. And the great thing with our drummer was he could only do 2 beats, but he did both of them extremely well. Didn't speed up, didn't slow down, stopped when you were meant to.
Now, you've done the 2 Peel sessions. You've been on the cover of magazines. You've had Single of the Week. And it comes time to do a record. And the first time you went in to record the record, didn't Bill Drummond have to remortgage his house?
Yeah, man.
And but did you feel under pressure because you're a music fan yourself?
Yeah.
You have a great ambition, expansive imagination, as we said before. There's a whole bunch of people behind you. Did you feel pressure to record a legendary classic album?
Yeah. And I knew that we could, but I knew that it would. First album's got to be it's like the sum total of everything that you've ever thought about rock and roll, and you've got to bring it forth, and it's got to be clad in a way that's acceptable to represent you. We worked towards that. The first album sleeve, I thought that merely taking acid would be enough. But if you're on acid, you sweat. And they had to light us in a way that didn't look like we were on acid. So that was immediately a really bad idea. And so when the album sleeve came out, it was awful. It looked terrible because we were really like full. Well, we'd been tripping the night before as well. So we'd been tripping for 2 days, so we were really out of it. But because I'd come out of punk, there was this current, we're doing an album, and it's got to be brilliant. But on the same time, we've got this twin, parallel, we won't compromise one bit. If we're going to be doing this, we've got to be doing it the way we believe. It can't be a career move. So we just gobble up trips.
And that was the second time you were recording, right? When you went back in after New York.
Yeah.
So tell us about, did you start taking psychedelics while you were recording, and how did that change the recording atmosphere and the music itself?
I played less bass and danced more. Yeah. And Balfour played bits of keyboard bass. It was good. It was really good because it kind of opened up our metaphor from being a tight post-punk band to being a post-punk band on acid, which is good.
I mean, you were kind of psychedelic before. I mean, do you think that taking psychedelics somehow legitimized those leanings?
I don't think they legitimized them because I've always had a firm belief that what makes rock and roll so brilliant is inauthenticity. I don't believe in authenticity. One of my favorite bands when I was a kid was Credence, Clearwater Revival. Well, John Fogerty is from the west coast of America. He adopts that born on the bayou voice. That's cool. It's ersatz. I like that it's ersatz. I can remember Treason coming out and the Sounds Review saying, Julian Cope wraps his dulcet Liverpudlian tones around the lyrics. And I'm like, pretty good considering I'm a posh boy from the Midlands. So people will read into you whatever you're being sold as. So I think to a certain extent, the fruitiness and the over-the-topness cut through the acid in any case. Possibly made me a little bit more Arthur Lee, because suddenly the edge was entirely there. To be on stage and to be in the middle of a trip really gives you an edge, because any moment you might lose it, and it makes it scary. And I think rock and roll should have an element of scariness. You don't want to rest on your laurels if you're a rock and roll performer. You want to be able to know that you might shit yourself.
And did you ever feel like you were going to do that when you were making the album or performing live?
We all took mushrooms when we were recording. We took so many mushrooms, we were like, 250 mushrooms? That's never going to go round. So we supplemented it with nutmeg. Balfi had this book about, being in, the urban man's guide to being in the middle of nowhere. And we were in Rockfield Studios, in Monmouthshire, in the middle of nowhere. So we got Sean, who was the manageress, to get us loads of, fresh nutmeg, and we ground all this nutmeg up and put it into a posset of milk and bring it to the boil over half an hour. We're like, wow, this was like the hedge witch's guide, the pauper's press. And so we brought it, and the posset of milk was seething for half an hour. And the mushrooms were kicking in, and it was good. And so we knocked down the nutmeg. And the nutmeg, it's a very... Loads and loads of nutmeg with mushrooms it's almost like... it's quite demonic, actually, because everybody starts to get like little... Their eyebrows will go up, or become Dennis Healy. And so we recorded like that. And I honestly think the nutmeg informed us not more than the mushrooms, because there's a hell of a lot of mushrooms.
What's your favorite memory while recording Kilimanjaro?
Finding out that I had a new manager. Bill Drummond had sold us to this guy. We knew him. Well, we didn't know him, but we knew of him. And I was standing there, and Bill Drummond's like, your new manager's driving up the drive. And I was at the bottom of the drive with Bill. And this guy came up the drive in a a British Racing green E-Type Jag. Yeah, Jaguar XKE. I was like, wow. And he kept going, and it never occurred to me to get out of the way. So he just kind of nudged me, and I just sat on the front of his car all the way up the hill. And I just thought, I want this guy to be my manager now, because that's just cool. He just wasn't fazed by my refusal to get out of the way. And that was my favorite moment.
And what's your favorite song on the album? Do you have a favorite song?
I think, and this is probably not from an audience point of view, but from an artist's point of view, the Soviet artist's point of view, the revolutionary post-punk, post-2/7's Clash, do it with whatever is to hand, whatever you've been bequeathed. Once all the musicians have been let out and have run away from you, what you're left with, it's Sleeping Gas. Because Sleeping Gas was cobbled together because of Gary's limitations, because of Paul Simpson's limitations, and because it became single of the week, and it was compared to 96 Tears, Louie Louie, I think maybe just those two songs. But both of those songs were the most reductionist songs of all time. And they were everything that I loved. And to me, they embodied krautrock as well. And I'd written the repetition in. I sat down and go, I'm going to sing I Wander Around this many times. And it's the Sleeping Gas, because it's the most symbolic of that time. And I think it's rigorously and fastidiously durable in it's got a disco bass line halfway through.
It's my favorite too, and as a fan, and not even knowing the backstory, it was always my favorite song on that album. Just one last thing before we take a short break. Is there anything we should listen out for when we're listening to the album today? Anything, little secrets hidden in there, or some a story?
there was this... When we did our second single, Bouncing Babies, there was a drug motif sneaking in. Mick Finkler and Dave Balfe were starting to smoke pot. And I was very sniffy about that. So they used to call black, because everybody was smoking black hash. They used to call it Black Sniffy, because I was sniffy about it. So when we cut it at Porcupine Cuts, he said, do you want to write anything? And Scobie Breesley was this, at the time, he was like a racing jockey who'd failed a drug test. So we thought he was heroic. So on the run-out groove, we put Black Sniffy for Scobie Breesley. So I know now, I know on the timeline that the drugs were coming in. In terms of the album, I think it's probably so loaded with Liverpool in jokes that I'd probably have to stand at the back and go, now! You know, like the bastard who goes, listen to when it comes in now. When the trumpet solo comes... No, not then, no. It's going to come in now. Now. Oh, I don't want to be that person. But yeah, it was loaded with them. Because obviously also there was a tremendous collective going on. I was the bully who barged in with as many ideas as I could, but everybody was really involved. Even like Paul Simpson had been out the band, he'd left the band, been out the band like 9 months. He was down for Kilimanjaro all the time, not because he wanted to be in Rockfield, but because he wanted to hang out with his homies in the middle of nowhere, because it's, and free with good food. So he was there and he was putting loads of stuff in, loads of ideas in. So I would say that Kilimanjaro is a really good Liverpool, a symbol of Liverpool, because I was generous with letting everybody's ideas come in, because I knew 35 years later that secretly everybody think I came up with them, and I can be generous now.
And are you proud of the album 35 years later?
Yeah, I think it's a good album. It's dance content. I really like. Joy Division's dance content was so brilliant. And I think that whole Northern Soul thing actually did inform a lot of that music. And I think it's a really good album. Yeah.
Well, I think we'll have a listen. Thank you so much, Julian.
Thanks for coming. When you listen to the album, I might dance at the back, but I can't drink beer, I can't drink beer and be coherent.
Okay.
So I'm going to go
so
and
you are going to drink beer
now. Yeah.
Okay.
Fall to pieces now.
Well, we're going to take a short break, about 15 minutes. If you want to stretch your legs, grab a beer, and we'll see you back here in 15. Did you get a chance to listen?
It was really weird because I was grooving, and then I realized that if I was grooving, I might be disruptive, so I grooved outside. But, Colleen was asking, are there any secret messages and stuff in there? And I was going, oh, yeah. And sure enough, I was remembering all these things. But there were a couple of things. Because I suddenly remembered that the guy who played trumpet on this was Hurricane Smith, Norman Hurricane Smith, who produced the first Pink Floyd album. And what was so funny about him was he was this lovely guy, but he was so clearly, even by then, we're talking about middle of 80, he was so used to telling Syd Barrett stories that he told them the way he'd tell anybody. So you couldn't prize anything out of him beyond. And I remember that, so that's kind of like I'm telling you about the uneventfulness of it. And the other thing that I was saying to my friend Fran, who I haven't seen in years, who's out the back, holy shit, the engineer gave me smack. And I hadn't thought about that since then, because so gutted, because the only people on Smack at that time, because people were so innocent, were this guy Jamo and Paul Hornby, who played drums in Pink Military. And we were really frightened of those guys, because they were on Smack. And obviously I never took Smack again, because I was just fucking phobic of shit like that. But as this was playing such a volume, I had a Jean-Paul Sartre moment.
Ooh.
And I was curled up under the mixing desk on Smack. Fuck's sake, man. I'm sorry about that. That's dark.
So you're definitely getting some flashbacks in more ways than one.
Yeah.
What did you think of it as an album? Because I'm sure you don't sit home listening to this album very often.
It hangs together really well. I mean, we worked hard at it. It was what Young would term the summum bonum of our existence till then.
To me, I'm like worn out. I mean, it's the energy is frenetic. It's
I'll tell you
incredible.
what sums up that album. Balfe, Dave Balfe, the keyboard player. He'd have to take 2 trips for every trip I took. And I did this interview with Balfe sitting there during the Teardrops. And I said, me and Balfe we had 5 trips each. And as it kicked in, and Balfe interrupted, and he went, fuck off, Cope, you had 5, I only had 4. That was Dave Balfe. He'd always want it to be accurate, but it would still be extreme. And I think that summed it up, that Balfe was like, I'm bringing an element of measure to this band. I don't think so.
Oh, I think it sounded great. I'm sure you guys all did too. Questions? Do we have a roving microphone? Yes, we do. Anyone have a question for Mr. Cope? There's one right here.
Good evening, Julian.
Good evening.
Were you happy with the running order of the album when it came out? Having heard other bands talk about their albums in the respect of the record company, not particularly happy with the running order of the final product?
I was more of a pragmatist than that. As we arrived at Rockville Studios, which is beautiful and in the middle of nowhere, the Bunnymen were leaving, having recorded their album. Evidence that the Teardrops album was delayed while we really polished it up. Will Sargent from the Bunnymen and I walked down the Mono River. Will didn't cry because he would not cry. But he just said, he kept looking ahead and he kept saying, fucking beware of Dave Balfe, man. He'll fucking cut your balls off. It was heavy. But I really paid attention to what Will had said. I think the first Bunnymen album is quite brilliant. It's succinct. It's polished. But it's raw and it's great. But I did totally pay attention. So in terms of the running order, there was a collective element to it, but I was a bullying motherfucker. So Balfe would have say, Bill Drummond would have say, but on something like that, I don't know what your opinion is, but if you disagree with it, it's probably me to blame.
No disagreement at all, actually. Thank you.
This one right back here. If we can get the microphone over quickly. Come on, Alan. You can do it.
Good evening, Julian. A really simple question. Why is it called Kilimanjaro?
It was originally going to be called Everybody Wants to Shag the Teardrop Explodes. We went on tour and it soon became very, very clear that that wasn't ironic from the way that mainly Dave Balfe behaved. So we needed a new name and we were absolutely... I know that I've been out of step with a lot of, my career. But I'm quite a zeitgeist lover. If I can nail myself to the zeitgeist, I did during punk. And they fell for it. So I like the zeitgeist. I wanted a really post-punk name. Obviously, we weren't really using the term so much then. We were. Maybe the arch writers were. But we called it Kilimanjaro because it was absolutely succinct. It's a great place. And Les Pattinson from the Bunnymen just said, why don't you call it Kilimanjaro? I was like, thank you, Les.
Another question? Dave?
Did Wiley or Mac have anything to say about putting stuff that you'd done in Crucial 3 on the album?
Early on in an album, in a career, you're going to be a pest. You're going to take, borrow, bully. You're going to do anything to get that fucker in the shops. Bouncing Babies was a Mystery Girls song. I'd written it. Pete Burns had written lyrics for it. When we made it into a disco song, Wiley wouldn't have minded in any case because he hated disco.
That's the answer.
That's the answer.
Anyone else have a question? Anyone up there? Oh, here we go. Right there.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just wondering, when you look back on your life personally and professionally, what you consider or quantify as your biggest success and why?
Easy. My daughters. No, it's true. It's true.
Yes.
Like on a totally different level. I always wanted 3 daughters. I had 2. But I figured that Dorian's father died young, so she's my 3rd daughter. I live in a matriarchy, but I do know my PIN number. Yeah? The way that I see it is this. Somewhere in culture, a very long while ago, we lived in a female-dominated culture. But there were police. There were men who believed in that female-dominated culture. A kind of a Praetorian guard of the goddess. The evidence that I have that the female was at the root of culture is the reason I'm an Odinist. Because in Odinism, everything about in the Norse myths he gets from the female. If you look in Russian culture, which is Ruski, the Rus were Odinist. 1 is Odin, and 2 is Diva. Odin got everything from the diva. I wanted females because I don't trust myself in my pre-coital situation. As far as I'm concerned, that time is a place to aim for, though we can't. As soon as we started making Bronze Age tools, they were things that we could replicate very easily. Stone Age was different because you're going to be working all day to make an axe. Then suddenly somebody pours some molten liquid, and they can make 10 per hour. So it becomes very unfemale very quickly. But even in the heart of the most male-dominated culture, the Romans, at the heart is the female. As evidence, everything to do with the mother is ma. Everything to do with the mother is the marriage, is matriarchal, is ma. Well, in the matriarchal, the Romans give it away by everything that is magma is greater. The ma prevails. Everything that is lesser, like the parson, the patriarchal, the pa, is parva. Parva means lesser. So I know that at one point in ancient culture, I have evidence, even in Latin, that the mother prevailed. Therefore, I am beloved of the mother. rock and roll is an Odinist outpouring. It's not Dionysian. It's not of the South. It's of the North, and it's beautiful, and it's female-based. And that's why I say I'm a motherfucker.
Does anyone else have a question? Over here. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, hi, Julian.
Hello.
Teardrops had, there was you and Gary Dwyer, but there was loads of other musicians. In your fantasy Teardrop Explodes, who would you pick for keyboardist, bassist, all-time guitarist?
What, if I was doing an all-star lineup?
Yeah.
I tell you what, who's the most overlooked member of the Teardrop Explodes is Jeff Hammer, the Christian keyboard player who deputized for Dave Balfe in one of his times of being ostracized. Jeff Hammer was really good, and I'm really sorry that we used to use his Bible to skin up with. I am genuinely sorry about that. Because as an Odinist, I would love to say that one of the things I love about Christ was his generous overview of what human beings could be. The fact that it's virtually impossible for even the saints to achieve that's nothing wrong with being high-reaching. The Teardrops was so pragmatic, you know? I mean, people played what they played. As I say, you know, if I could get out of playing bass, because it meant that Balfe played bass keyboard, then I'd do it. It'd be hard to have an all-star lineup. They all contributed. You know, I mean, that's the thing. The members of the Teardrops, I was inclusive while they were there. Once they were fucked off, obviously they were fucked off, and I was awful. But it didn't last very long. We did a lot of stuff. It was exactly 4 years from our first gig to our splitting up. It was symbolic, and it was ruthless. We were on drugs, but we were a symbol of youth. That was what it was about. It was a symbol of youth. That's why, even though I'm absolutely accepting, I used to be quite angry about reunion culture, but I'm very accepting of it now. I don't buy it, because the Teardrop Explodes was a moment. We were a manifestation of punk, opportunism, chancerism, and doing stuff while you were young that you couldn't do or even wish to replicate when you're old, because you just wouldn't be that shocked. I remember coming off we went to Portugal, and we went down this back alley, and we scored some pot, and it was tea. Green tea. So we all made the effort. We went back down into this Casbari area. We said, "This is tea." And he goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry, man. I was just having a brew, man. You know, no problem. Yeah, have this." We went back to the hotel. It was tea. It didn't matter because we had loads of acid. So we all did acid. And we took acid, and we were over the night. The next morning, we had to be back for a record company thing. So we all just necked loads more acid and got on the plane. And the only person who was paranoid of the guy who was clearly a cop was Troy, who wasn't on acid.
That's why he was paranoid.
Yeah, man. And I said to him afterwards, you know, it doesn't matter, man. You should just have taken acid and you wouldn't have been paranoid anymore. Mm-hmm. And we didn't get busted, and it was a vibe. But that's for young people. You can't replicate that, can you? You can't go, here's a careerist version of that.
That's so true. So no reunion then.
I don't think so.
Okay. Any other questions? I have a question then, actually. I'd like to know what you're up to now.
I'm writing a novel,
Mm-hmm.
Which is, it's really, what happened was, a couple of years ago, I wrote a novel and it was published And enough people got it for me to think I can write a novel. And I know so many rum stories from around the world. I've been off my head in more countries than almost anybody else in the world. And I know the levels that people can sink to. And one of the things I love, Jim Morrison said the West is the best. He didn't provide much evidence, but Jim didn't need to because it was earlier on in rock and roll. I'm the one with the evidence, ladies and gentlemen. The West is the best. What Jung said, C.G. Jung said a brilliant thing. He said the reason that religion is not necessary anymore is we've provided evidence of a world, I'm paraphrasing, provided evidence of a world that doesn't need God. And what he really said was that anybody who could really find the time to continue to be obsessed with God and be annoyed with people who were godless, they would just, emos, really. He didn't use the term emos, but you know what I mean. And he said that we are in a unique position in the West, to be living in doubt. To be living in doubt, ladies and gentlemen, it's heroic. We don't know what's next. You think anybody else does? Of course they don't know. It's absurd. But rock and roll allows you to not only live in doubt, but to dance while you're living in doubt. Motherfucker!
So you're writing your second novel.
Yeah.
Are you doing any research for any other kinds of books like the
other book that I'm writing, and you know what, I don't even like bringing this up anymore because I was commissioned by Faber and Faber to write this book about 5 years ago. And it's a bastard of a book. You need time off like every 3 months because it's exhausting, it's debilitating. You feel like you're under psychic attack. It's called Lives of the Prophets, A New Perspective. And of course, in order to provide a genuine, rounded overview of a life of each of the great world prophets, you've got to investigate what makes the world prophets. So you've got to investigate people who at one point in their lives were also perceived as potential world prophets. There's nothing more debilitating than studying the life of a false prophet. It's exhausting. So I have to have a bit of a sleepy every so often.
So do you decide whether a prophet, is it like Siddhartha Gautama, and are you taking different historical figures and then deciding whether or not they
I tell you what,
merit the
specifically,
term prophet?
Oliver Cromwell, I'm doing as a false prophet. Because he was somebody who was informed by God himself. All those things that went on in Ireland went on because he was informed by God himself. And he was wrong. Now, I'm not saying all the world prophets were right, but he was wrong, and he was demonstrably wrong, because who worships Cromwell nowadays? And I'm doing all those kind of people. To a certain extent, it's going to be a fantastic overview because I am godless. But I've interfaced with the divine so many times in my life, on a higher level and on a debased level. I'm like Zoroaster, the first prophet who dared to look at his pantheon of gods and just go, "You're not a god, you're a demon, mate." I'm like that. I will leave no stone unturned in my great quest to bring to the West a fantastic overview of what it's like to be stuck in belief.
I look forward to reading that. I hope you finish it.
Yeah, I will.
How about music? Any music that you're working on?
I've got a new band. It's a good band. We're called Dope. I figured if I'm going to form a band that's really, really sums me up, they've got to be called Dope. Because all I've done, it's even got a logo. And the logo is merely the Julian Cope from the island period. And I've just replaced the capital C with the P. I've just inverted it. So it just says Dope. Or it sounds like massive, tripped out, played groove. It's what I would term it's unsignposted. And to me, what makes the best psychedelia is like when you're like, what song's this? You know, when you look on an album sleeve and there's like 9 songs, and like, are we in this? Yeah. No, we're on 8B. When did we become on 8B? I didn't even know we were on 8A. I thought we were still on 7C. That's psychedelic.
Yeah.
Dopes like that.
Definitely.
Yeah. The album's coming out, and it's a triple gatefold sleeve. And I figured that, you know, like when you look at the best psychedelic albums, you're just dumbfounded. Yeah, it's like I don't get their metaphor. I don't even understand their metaphor. When you look at the dope sleeve, it's like, you just keep looking into it. In the past on albums, I've had things like, you know, reading lists and favorite album lists. On dope, it's a lot more lowbrow. We've got this column on the right-hand side. It's just easy games for stupid people. I can play that while I listen to this record.
And you just brought me to my last question. Do you have what are your top 5 albums of all time? It's a difficult one.
I've got about 100 top 5 albums.
Just choose random 5 then.
I tell you what, I'll base them on things I listen to.
Okay, that's good. You do need a directive.
Side 1 of Outside Inside by Blue Cheer. Confusing, inchoate, stumbling, poorly mixed. Yeti by Amondul 2. Absolutely more psychedelic than anything. Totally mysterious. A sleeve of life. Don't know what anybody's playing on what track. Yeti. Paradisjois Dul, Amondul 1. The most beautiful folk psychedelic post-punk antecedent of all time. That's so moving. My eldest daughter does yoga to Paradisjois Dul, to Love is Peace mainly. And I actually get tears. I find that such a moving album. I guess the first 13th Floor Elevators album, I don't listen to it anymore only because I can't find it. Because we've got this big section A to F I can't reach. I mean, literally, I've got T stuff on top of it. So first 13th Floor Elevators album.
You have one more.
Ooh.